What's up, gangsters? It is early September 2021, and it is time, finally, for one of the rarest things on YouTube lately, and that is a completed project video from Rube Goldberg Enterprises. Yeah, it's been a long time. I don't even know if I know how to do this anymore. I had, I think, exactly 2, maybe 3 of these last year. I've done one of them this year, and that was for a bust that I painted that was exactly one piece. So yeah, it's not that I've lost my mojo or that I haven't been doing any model making. I did have a studio renovation in the middle of last winter, and that took a few months out of it. But honestly, if you've been following any of my random videos, you know that I've been working mostly on one project. And that is this thing right here. Let's make sure we get the box lid right side up. That is this monster, the 1/32 scale Hasegawa p-40, as reboxed by our friends over at Eduard. This is the deluxe edition. These are no longer available in any form, as far as I understand, and I was fortunate enough to snatch this up as soon as Eduard announced that they weren't going to be selling it anymore. But it's pretty cool. It comes, you know, if you can find one, I'm sure you'll pay a pretty penny for it, but comes with a metal stamping of the Romain Haugault artwork that's on the box cover, and also a paper print of that. And it comes with basically all of Eduard's brass and resin bits that they make for this kit. So it's pretty neat. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. And we're going to talk about all that. But first, let's take a look at what I've managed to accomplish with this thing. Okay, so here we go. Let's talk about all of that. So first things first with this kit, you know, this kit is what I consider kind of typical of Hasegawa in that it's got pretty robust engineering, you know, no real risks for either them or the model maker. You know, they don't tend to do a whole lot of slide molding. They don't do a lot of super delicate parts. You know, and the engineering of how most of their stuff goes together is typically pretty solid. But, you know, kind of what you get for that is you get some sort of blunt details, if you will. You know, a good example is the seat. This is the kit seat, which I'll talk about why that's not in there here in a second. But you can see, I mean, you know, it's a sort of reasonable facsimile for the real thing. But it's not exactly right, and the detail is you know, it's pretty soft, and some of it's not even there because of, you know, injection molding limitations. And it's, you know, thick, not necessarily the correct shape, but pretty close. And again, that's just typical of Hasegawa. This is the throttle quadrant, also not in there for the same reason that the other one is. Again, you can see, not super, you know, like if that was Tamiya, they might have the levers as separate parts or something, but Hasegawa is just not going to do that. The instrument panel actually is not bad. I almost used it. You know, it's really, you know, pretty nicely detailed, pretty well molded. But, you know, and you could paint that up and have it look really good, but that's just not what I wanted to do on this. So, there, you know, I had a bunch of choices to make. This kit also, if you don't know, and this is, I think, is true of both their 132nd and their 148th Warhawks, gives you the option of building either the earlier version with the short tail or the later version with the long tail. So basically, this thing could be anything from a p-40K mid-production and later, or it could be earlier because they give you both parts. They give you the short tail and the long tail. But this gives you the ability to go clear out to the p-40 in, which is mostly what this boxing of the kit is supposed to be. All of the artwork that they give you in the instruction sheet, every one of these color schemes for this is a p-40 in of one production block or another. So, but we'll talk about exactly what mine ended up being as we go along. Anyway, it's one of the things that I really don't like about the kit, and I don't like this on any kit, to be fair. I hate it when they give you options because it's almost never, you know, it's always a compromise, right? Like in this case, you've got in addition to all the standard business to deal with an aircraft fuselage, like, you know, in terms of taking care of the fuselage seam and reinstating detail after you've filled it and all that stuff. This one, you've got a joint that runs basically right here through this side of the insignia, and it's a giant pain in the ass because, you know, it fits together fairly well and the engineering is robust. You know, the tail's never going to fall off, but you know, you've got a seam there that runs across a whole bunch of panel lines and rivets. And so, you know, even once you get that seam taken care of, you're going to have detail there that you've got to figure out how to reinstate and match. And that's just not always a straightforward thing to do. It wasn't too bad on this. Hasegawa, on this kit at least, the panel lines are actually pretty brilliant. I love what they did because it's kind of hard to tell, but if you look, you will see, like here on these gun bays, those panel lines are wider and deeper than panel lines that just represent joints between panels. So not only do they look good, I mean, not only are they, what am I trying to say? Not only are these panel lines really well molded because they have a nice square profile and they're deep, so they hold washes really well, But you get the opportunity to differentiate between what I call functional panel lines that I like to put a black wash in, and just regular old, panel lines between joints, and you can kind of see the differences there. But with those wider panel lines, it can be a little bit of a challenge to match when you have to reinstate them like you do in that area right there. But, it came out not too bad. I did fight some ghost seams, and that was kind of a weird deal because I used my favorite sprue goo mix for the last year or so, and that is this right here. This is clear hasegawa sprue, which I like. Clear sprue is the purest form of polystyrene, and I started using that because we all know clear styrene is pretty brittle, and I always found that my old mix of sprue goo, which is this right here. This is hasegawa and Tamiya gray sprue with a little bit of green paint in it, green lacquer to make it easy to see. This will give me a pretty good, it does a pretty good job, but it's always a little softer than the surrounding material by just a little bit. It also will do that thing where you get little pinholes sometimes in sprue goo. And so I thought, well, if given that clear sprue is harder than regular sprue, maybe that difference will make sprue goo made from clear sprue about the same hardness as the surrounding material. And it does work out that way for the most part. It works good. And this one also, unexpectedly, for whatever reason, does not give me any of those little pinholes. So what I think maybe is that maybe the modifiers that they put in polystyrene to make it tougher and less brittle with colored sprues, maybe some of that stuff is what causes some of that outgassing that gives you those little pinholes. Anyhow, so I used that everywhere I had to do any filling on this thing. And, and one of the challenges with sprue goo is that sometimes you'll get ghost seams, or at least that's the theory, because it is, it's based on Tamiya extra thin, it softens the plastic, blah, blah, blah. Well, what was weird is that I had a ghost seam that I fought tooth and nail for literally weeks on this side of the fuselage, but on the other side, no ghost seam at all. Never, not even a little bit. And they were both done exactly the same way. So I don't even know what to think about that. Then, in order to get different versions, they give you different clear sections. And the clear section includes this scalloped window right here. In the other version, obviously, it's got this sort of straight section back there. You can see that. And so what happens with the clear part is that the joint for that is right here. Runs vertically right there and then horizontally right through there. And that's, it's right where it's probably has to be for the later style canopy. But for the earlier style with the scallop, it's a total hassle because, again, you've got that panel line and joint crisscross situation right there. And in that case, I didn't use any filler at all because it was a really good fit. I just used extra thin, and I fought those ghost seams on that part right there all the way into color coat. It was a hassle. Another place where I had to deal with that involved not much filler anyway, was the machine gun inserts right here. Okay, there's a piece right there that gets you the 3 gun barrels sticking out of the leading edge. And so you've got a rectangular joint that runs around those. Again, I fought those ghost seams right there on both sides, clear into color coat. And it would be like, it's the definition of a ghost seam where you think it's all taken care of and then you come in the next day and it's right back again. And my firm belief is that most of the time they don't truly go away. They just become less visible for some reason. And typically it's all about light. Like I'd be working in the evening, dark outside, and I'm just relying on bench lights. and I would sand out the ghost seam and feel satisfied. Then I'd come in the next morning and I'd have this hard directional sunlight coming in from my window that's directly to my left, and that ghost seam, even though it's only maybe 1 or 2 thousandths of an inch deep, that's 0.05 millimeters for you guys in metric land, it still is enough of a relief there that it'll cast a shadow and you'll see it. Whereas you didn't see it the night before, and you think, oh, well, it reappeared, when it really didn't. It's just now become more visible because of the angle of the light. Anyway, I fought those a lot, and but that's just one of those deals. It kind of is what it is. But the point it really drove home for me is that it's much less about sprue goo than it is just about Tamiya extra thin. And I know that's why some guys will use super glue as their adhesive for everything, but I'm just not going to do that. I'm paranoid. I just, super glue is really just a mechanical bond, and I just, I know it's dumb, but I just, I don't ever want the thing to spontaneously fall apart, ever. And extra thin gives you a true welded joint because it dissolves the plastic. So, yeah. Anyway, the other thing about the Hasegawa engineering, besides the optional tail, because what I really wish they would just do is pick the most popular version and mold the kit for that, and then give you the parts and let you, chop the tail off if you want to do the short tail version. I know it's a cost thing and they're trying to get as many versions out of every kit as they can, but I still just don't like it. Just don't like it. Nope, not at all. Anyway, the other thing that I super duper do not like is when they try to put a panel line along an assembly line. And what I mean specifically in this case is, let's turn here to, hopefully I can find it. All right. These instructions, by the way, really good. I like this instruction book. Let's just take a quick look at it. They are not worried about killing paper. The instructions are large. They give you a sprue map, which I always appreciate, and they give you an indication of which parts you're not going to need. That's always really cool. They tell you where all the photo etch is supposed to go and which parts are supposed to be removed or filed off. So I like that. This is a really, really good, high-quality instruction book. And I wish every kit maker would do that. They even give you a map for where all of your masks go, because those are included as well. But, okay, here's the step that I wanted to show you. So you see right there, you've got pieces for each version, because there's a couple of different styles of panels that go around the exhaust stacks on P-40s. And so you've got to install that piece to get the version that you want. Same thing with those carburetor vent things, that I5 part and I6. And so in both of those cases, what you end up with is they try to make the joint go along the natural panel line. And that seems logical, right? That makes logical sense. You're going to just glue the thing in there, and in theory, you're not going to have to do anything else. You're going to have a panel line. And in theory is the key phrase there, because that's about all that's ever good for. Tamiya, honestly, is the only kit maker that I've ever seen pull this off effectively, where the resulting joint line actually matches the other panel lines, and you can actually use it for that without any modification. Most of the time, not at all. Not a good match, and it's a glaring fault, at least for me it is. And that was the case here, because as you can see, these panel lines right here, pretty wide, pretty robust. Let me hopefully this camera's going to focus. Let me change the angle a little bit here. So, all right, so you can see that panel line there on top of, where the scoop is, pretty wide, pretty robust. They all looked like that, where they were molded around the nose. Okay, the panel line right there behind it going across the fuselage, that is that's a separate panel line in a couple of places. Okay, like right here, I'm losing my train of thought here, getting off the tracks. Anyway, let me just try to get the camera pointing the right spot. Anyway, so right in here, where you've got this panel that goes around the exhaust stacks, those panel lines were, I mean, the fit was good, too good, because the panel lines were too skinny. Back here at the back and on the top and on the bottom. Same thing here with this piece. So I spent a shit ton of time re-scribing. I didn't fill them in. I didn't have to do that, but I had to re-scribe those panel lines and widen them out and make them match the other panel lines in the area for it to look good. And it's a hassle. It's really hard to do and get it really, you know, as perfect as we'd all like for them to be. Mr. Fly, could you just please fuck off? Yeah, it's that time of year. Anyway, so that's the other thing. Again, I just wish that they would just make it in one version and, you know, charge me more. I don't mind paying more to not have to deal with those things. But that's really, I mean, I guess since I'm sort of on the subject of what did I not like about the kit, that kind of, I mean, honestly, those are my biggest gripes. It really, honestly, was a pretty fun kit, and it really did not involve much drama. I was not a super huge fan of some of the engineering in the landing gear area, but then again, I never am. I hate landing gear. The landing gear itself went in really well, but the gear doors had just no good attachment points. And so, you know, again, typical Hasegawa engineering, pretty robust, pretty cool. But going back to the cockpit, that's where I started. Not necessarily because I had to, but because Chris Meddings was getting ready to do a new book about pimping your aircraft cockpits using, you know, whatever scratch building or whatever methods you want to make your aircraft cockpits more detailed. And he asked me if I wanted to do a chapter for the book, and I was like, yeah, man, I immediately thought about doing this model and doing the cockpit because I knew the detail was relatively simplistic and it would be a good opportunity to do some customization, not only from that perspective, but also because, you know, as you can see, a P-40 has a pretty wide open cockpit. It's easy to see in there. So I thought, all right, good opportunity. And the reason that the seat is not in there, same thing with the throttle quadrant, the yoke for the control column, and is also not in there, are because I designed new parts in Fusion 360 and 3D printed them in resin. So you get a good look at that, and all this stuff is going to be hopefully coming out soon in Chris's book when he gets all that published. But hopefully you can kind of see that. It just produces a much more realistic result. And it was not easy. That seat took me about 20 hours of dedicated CAD time before I had a design that I was happy with. But I like it. I like the way it came out. The detail's pretty good. It's kind of hard to see in the shadows there, but there's a lot of detail on the side walls of this style of P-40 seat that again, you can't do that with injection molding unless you use lifters or slides or something, and so that alone made it worth it to me. Another thing you can kind of see over there on the side of the cockpit, down there behind that lever with the black ball on top of it, there's a lever mechanism over there, and that's molded into the sidewall of the kit part, and it's just not good. And what that is it's the mechanism that actuates the louvers underneath the chin. And so I also created that in CAD, had that printed. If I flip it around here, you can see the throttle quadrant. This is, I think, much cooler and much better than the kit part. People say, man, that knob is really big, but it actually was pretty big. It might be a little bit overscale, but the way that I created that silver knob was I actually sliced a piece of beer can aluminum off for the lever that I glued down in the slot, and then I took the ball off of the lever on the kit part, because they do give you a separate lever for the throttle thing, that big one with the silver knob. Anyway, I sliced the knob in half and glued it on each side of the little aluminum sheet that made the lever. So it worked out pretty good. So yeah, and I carved almost all of the detail off of the sidewalls there and replaced it with my own, wires and hoses and cables and stuff. Now, as for the instrument panel, what I did there ended up being kind of a hybrid. It's going to be pretty hard to see in there, but what you've got, maybe I can do this without fucking breaking anything. Okay, there we go. That's a good view. It's also starting to rain cats and dogs outside, so hopefully the noise won't be too bad, but at any rate, that's a pretty good view of that instrument panel if the camera will stay focused. So what I did there is I had the Look instrument panel, bought that separately, and it was okay, but I just didn't totally like it. And so then I decided to get a Yahoo panel, because I love those, and I liked the top part where all the gauges were, but I did not like the lower part where all of those switches and knobs are, because, the Look panel is photo etch, and even though the detail is amazing, and it has a little bit of depth, I just didn't feel like it had enough depth to really capture the look of all of those knobs. So what I did is I used the part of the Look panel that I liked and the part of the Yahoo panel that I liked, combined the two into a kind of a hybrid that I really like. I think the effect is pretty good. Sometimes you just have to mix and match. The other thing that I did that I was pretty proud of, that was really kind of hard, was if you look over there on the right hand side, hopefully the camera will stay focused. Come on now. There we go. Come on, focus up. There we go. Okay, so you can see that round thing with the lever on it. That is the canopy retraction mechanism that comes with the kit, and it's okay, but right there next to it, you'll see a little L-shaped lever sticking out and a little bit of a mechanism behind there that you can kind of see. That whole mechanism back there is the carburetor vent mechanism, and it's not in the kit at all, which is kind of a bummer, because if you're gonna put these vents with the holes in them, you have to have that mechanism, because that's what they actuate. It's like a little slide louver thing. I'm not exactly certain how it works, but based on the drawings I've looked at, come on, stay focused. That mechanism is what does that. And so I scratch built that. I got to the point where where I realized that I needed to have that mechanism in there, and I had not designed one in CAD, and I was thinking about doing it, but then I realized it wasn't really the kind of part that really lent itself. And so I just one weekend decided, you know what, I'm gonna take inspiration from Mr. Chris Meddings, since he's doing this book and he's a master scratch builder, and I'm gonna just make that little thing myself. And I was pretty stoked. That's about 20 pieces of styrene sheet and some aluminum tubing. I think there may be some brass in there. There's some lead wire in there for the lever itself. Anyway, I was pretty stoked with the way that thing came out. and it gave me, I felt like, another level of realism in that cockpit. So anyway, that was the whole story with the cockpit, and got all that done, got it ready for the book, finished that part, and then moved on to the rest of it. And I really, I thought that this kit was going to be relatively simple and straightforward and pretty quick once I got past the whole cockpit thing. But yeah, it ended up taking me another 6 months after that, because the body work was pretty, while it was not terrible, it took me a while, because again, like carving all these panel lines and taking care of the ghost seams and just doing all that stuff, it just took a lot of time. The one thing that really was really good that did not take much time at all was the wing root joint. That wing root joint is as is. There is nothing that is rescribed or filled with that wing root joint. One thing that I did, though, to make sure that that fits super tight is rather than build the entire wing subassembly, the traditional thing where you put the top and bottom halves of the wing together and then join them to the fuselage, I didn't do that. I put the bottom half of the wing on the fuselage first, made sure it was in the right spot, got it glued in place. Then I eliminated all the alignment pins on the wing halves, and then came back and put the upper half of the wing on. And that way I was able to shove it in there firmly and make sure that this joint was as tight as could be. And that ended up with giving me a little bit of a misalignment around the perimeter of the wing on the leading and the trailing edge on the starboard wing. The port side wing, perfect. No issues. Everything worked the way it was supposed to. The starboard wing, on the other hand, had a lot of issues with misalignment. It was like 0.5 millimeter out here at the wingtip. But it's a lot easier to deal with that than it is to fill and sand and rescribe a wing root joint like that curves around and does all this business up here at the front. So I feel like that was a good strategic decision. The one thing that Hasegawa does not give you, and they really don't give you much in the way of rivets at all. It's typical of Hasegawa. These p-40s have a lot of rivets that run across the wings, and you don't get any of those except for these, 4 or 5 panel lines right here. They don't give you the rivets or the fasteners, because they're not rivets, they're actually screws, because this whole thing right here is a big sheet metal subassembly that screws on there after the wing is attached to the fuselage. Anyway, they don't give you any indication of any kind of fasteners along the lower joint. And that's understandable, because the mold is opening like this. And so you can do the ones along this part, but you can't do the ones along here because that'd create undercuts. So I punched those and drilled them all to make those show. And I think that was a pretty good move as well. If I'd really wanted to spend more time, I could have totally justified doing all of the other riveting, because on p-40s you get this really characteristic pattern of people walking around in this area where the paint wears off of the ridges caused by the stiffeners that are underneath the skin, and then not so much in the lower lying areas where the sheet metal gets kind of beat down. And it looks really cool, but again, I would have had to commit to riveting the entire airframe, and I just didn't want to. Just didn't feel like it. Too lazy. But what I did do, and I'll talk about this when I talk more about the finishing part, is capture that pattern along the rivets and panel lines that they do give you. So it's a little bit of a compromise, but I think it still looks pretty dope. The other place where the fit was really challenging and took a lot of work, if you ever get your hands on one of these, you'll beware, is this area right in here. This whole thing right here, this nacelle that houses the front part of the landing gear. On the real p-40, all of this is a sheet metal subassembly that's made up of 3 or 4 different parts. And Hasegawa got it right in making it have that joint right there. I've had a couple of people say, hey dude, you didn't fill that joint right there. Well, sorry, but that joint is actually there, and it extends over to here like I've got it. But the fit is not great. I spent a lot of time getting that to look even as good as it does, because the part just is not a Tamiya quality fit right here in this area. And it is a pretty complex molding, but come on, it's possible. What's funny about those people calling me out for that joint is that they are not calling me out for the joint that should extend from right here all the way out to the front of the sheet metal fairing right there. Because there is actually a joint right there on the real thing. But it doesn't show up very well on all of them. I think maybe it's riveted and smoothed over. I don't know. It just doesn't show up all that well on the real aircraft. And honestly, I just didn't want to bother it with it, so I filled it in. The other place where you have to do a tricky bit of filling in is right here, because the way the wing joins to the fuselage, you end up with a horizontal joint that runs right in here. And so you've got to fix that while working around this curved panel line that you can see right here. And so I had to rescribe that to make it deeper before I started working this joint right here, because I didn't want to lose that. Because, again, rescribing something curved like that in an area like that, not fun. So definitely better to deepen it while you've still got it, and then go and do your sanding, filling and sanding in the surrounding areas. So anyway, that was the other real challenge. Honestly, it was really kind of, none of it was like really horrible. It wasn't, this was not like the terrible fit that you find on, like, the Accurate Miniatures Mitchell, for example, or some other aircraft kits that I've built. The fit was not horrible in any place. It was just far enough off to make it a lot of work to fix it. And so that's part of why it ended up taking me so damn long to just get to the point where I was ready to cover the whole thing with primer. And after that, everything was pretty smooth, with the exception of the few ghost seams that just would not go away. So at any rate, that's kind of a description of the kit. A couple of other things of note: the landing gear fit, not awesome. Had to do a little bit of adjustment to get it to be right. Engineering is good, but the fit just wasn't quite there. The other thing that really pissed me off and that I really hate is these Brasson wheels. Okay, these things are pretty standard resin wheels, and they look beautiful in the package. But the problem is, and this is really common with resin wheel producers, is that the wheel is separate from the tire. And I understand why, they want to give you the option for different versions, because there's 2 or 3 different versions of the wheels for P-40s, different versions of tires, and in theory, it should be easiest to paint the hub and then paint the tire separately, put them together, and have a perfect color separation between the wheel and the tire, right? Yeah. The problem is it never works out like that because they never fit right. Because almost invariably, the wheel is enough smaller than the hole in the tire part that you've got a gap there, and you got to deal with that if you want it to look worth a shit. And it's a huge pain in the ass. And I fought with these wheels for probably like a week because I just could not get happy with that joint. And to this day, I still am not really happy with them. They're okay, but again, I just wish that these manufacturers would just mold the wheel and the tire as one piece. I mean, yeah, okay, it's going to cost more because you're going to have to include a complete wheel and tire for each version, but I don't care. I'll pay more. I don't care. And it's not like it's going to double the price of the resin. And even if it does, now it's going to cost $10 instead of $5 or $15 instead of $8. Well, it's just not that big of a deal. And I really wish that they would be more modeler friendly on that kind of stuff. It's just a giant hassle. I mean, we all know that resin casting is not perfect. You're going to get shrinkage. It's unavoidable. And since we know that, why not just mitigate that risk by engineering it in a simpler fashion instead of, trying to make it so complicated? It's just, just baffles me. Anyhow, that's that. That's all about the kit. And the next thing we'll talk about is the paint and the weathering. Actually, I'm not going to talk about weathering too much as far as technique goes, because I actually did a 7-part series on my channel called Oil Paint Rendering for Aircraft, where I went over all of these tricks that I did with oils. And I feel like it's a pretty exhaustive look at the details of that process. So I'm not going to spend much time talking about that here. I really want to talk more just about the overall look and what I was trying to accomplish. So first of all, let's talk about color scheme. So, you know, the thing with P-40s, you know, pretty standard with the overall olive drab and then this green scalloping. So what I did there is I airbrushed all those by hand. I've got a new favorite thing in my airbrush stash, and that is, where is it? Okay, here it is. This is my new absolute favorite. I did a video about this thing. This is what I call Frankenbrush. And this is a GSI Procon Boy PS275, but it's got guts in it from the 267. And by guts, I mean the spray head and the nozzle. And it's got a needle from an Iwata HPB, which is a 0.2 millimeter needle. So that gives me a 0.2 millimeter nozzle, 0.2 millimeter needle with the trigger style pull. And it's super controllable, and I can do a lot of really cool shit with it, including spraying things like all of these scallops in green. And most of that is, I mean, I didn't mask any of that. It was, well, okay, let me actually retract everything I just said, because I did some of them with the Frankenbrush. I did a bunch more of them because I hadn't gotten the Frankenbrush together yet with my Badger Sotar. And the Badger Sotar is okay. It obviously will spray really fine lines, but it was a lot more work than it was with Frankenbrush. So I actually gave away the Sotar. So anyhow, but there is one blatant mistake that the super knowledgeable P-40 experts amongst you have probably already spotted, and that is that there really should not be any green scallops on top of the ailerons. And you can see that in the production drawings where they do the color scheme layout. But I didn't see those drawings until it was too late. I was already well beyond the point of no return with those, because I'd already painted them, done several layers of weathering, and I was just like, nope, I'm not fixing that. That's not going to happen. And so I'm just going with, yeah, this was one that slipped through. Somebody didn't get the, somebody at the factory also did not see those drawings. It's not a major deal, but it is a point of accuracy, and it is a goof on my part, but it could certainly be worse. So the thing that I think people are really going to ask me about or challenge me on is the skull. So let's talk about that. Why did I do this much more modern looking skull than what is typical of the Burma Banshees? And that's what this bird is supposed to represent. Is it's supposed to be a sort of could have been aircraft from the 80th Fighter Group, one of the Burma Banshees, but not any particular aircraft. I made up the tail number, I made up the serial number, and hopefully I didn't goof on the serial number. The number that's underneath there, I'm pretty sure is, it's random, but hopefully it won't be another little episode like I had on my Spitfire that I did last year, which was also a could have been color scheme. And when I looked at the listings for serial numbers and created the serial number for that Spitfire, I thought I was doing good. Neglected to realize that I was actually giving it a serial number for a Sterling. So yeah, that was a goof. Somebody caught me on that pretty quickly. But I don't think that's going to happen to me here. That's part of the reason why that number's covered up. But, I wanted to incorporate my own number 19 on there like I try to do on a lot of stuff. And I wanted to do this different stylized skull. And let me talk about the reason why. So when you look at Burma Banshee nose art, and you've got really good examples of that on the decal sheet from Hasegawa, or actually from Eduard for this kit. And these are really good decals, okay? They're printed by Cartograph. You get a full set of them. Everything is really beautiful on this decal sheet. But I mean, I already knew I wasn't going to be using the insignia or any of the numbers because I paint all that stuff. But I also, I just don't like those skulls. I mean, come on, they look like they were painted by a drunken fifth grader. And I'm sure somebody, is going to accuse me of hating on the ground crew guy who painted those. But look, I'm sorry, I just think they look goofy. And these, the ones that were on Lulu Bell, were less goofy than a lot of them were. I mean, there's worse. But at any rate, I just didn't want to do it. I wanted to do something that was a little more, I don't know, like comic book-y, I guess. And I just was like, okay, so what to do? And I spent a lot of time collecting research photos on p-40s and Burma Banshees in particular. I've got like 600 images in my collection now. And one day I stumbled on this photo right here. All right, this is from the 80th. That is one of the Burma Banshees. And take a look at this pimp and his skull. There's some pretty interesting differences there. First of all, he didn't try to make the exhaust stacks come out of the eye socket. Good move, right? That's like fundamental. There's also a lot of shading there. It's just overall looks like somebody with way more talent did this skulls than did the other ones. And I was kind of thinking, all right, if I'm a 20-something fighter pilot in the Burma Banshees and I look around and I see, all of them getting painted up with skulls that look like this, I'm telling that dude, you come anywhere near my airplane with a paintbrush and I'm going to shoot you. So I'm like, okay, now I have a little bit of justification for doing something that's a little more high speed because of this guy right here who's exceptional. And so I used this as my inspiration. And what I did is I went out on the old interwebs and I found myself an illustration of a skull that was just like some kind of clip art or whatever, pulled it into Photoshop, modified it to, simplify it, make it where it was just, black and white, add the vampire teeth, and just, basically just shape it up into a skull that I liked. And then I produced masks on my silhouette portrait too, and painted all that using MRP. And I'm honestly, I know that I'll catch some heat for it, and that's okay, because I think it looks pretty dope. And the number one thing is I got the look that I was after, and it's unique. I know there's not ever going to be another one like it. And that really, again, was one of my primary goals. So that's the story on that, and I'm sticking to it. As far as the rest of it, just like everything else I do these days, this is all MRP lacquer. I just love their stuff, but I did a lot of mixing and matching to create my own color tones and get to the olive drab that I wanted. I did not use any of their olive drabs right out of the bottle. It's all, kind of mixing and matching. What else can I say about the paint? That's really about it. That was my goal. And as far as the overall look, all I'm going to really say about that is that I really wanted to make the filthiest airplane that anybody's ever seen. And I don't know if I pulled that off, but I was really trying to channel some Mike Rinaldi. I was like, okay, if Rinaldi was going to do a p-40, what would it look like? And again, I don't know if I pulled that off. I may have completely missed the mark on that. But overall, I feel pretty happy with the way this thing came out. The weathering was complex. There's pretty much no surface of this thing that's been untouched. but between oils and acrylic inks, and just doing a lot of paint work, fading and manipulation, I feel like I got there. One thing in particular that I should probably talk about is how I did the wing root chipping, because I wanted to get that look where the paint is chipped clear down to the metal, but more abraded off of the primer, because that's typically, I mean, that's typically what happens. Paint flakes off of metal, but tends to fade or abrade off of other paint. And so I wanted to capture that difference. And the way that I did that is I laid down my aluminum base, which is just MRP Super Silver. That's my go-to aluminum color. Put on my Tresemme medium hold number 3 for my hairspray layer. Then I came on top of that with, this is actually Mr. Color. I forget which one it is, but it's their yellow zinc chromate. And then came on top of that with the color coat, my first layers of olive drab. And I built up all the olive drab on top of that, and no hairspray in between the olive drab and the zinc chromate. And the reason that I did that is because I knew that I was going to use sandpaper to bring out the exposed zinc chromate. And that's just using little tiny pieces of Infini sanding sponge. I typically use 1,000 or 1,500 grit for this trick. I cut little tiny chunks of it and hold them in gripper tweezers, and that enables you to get really precision sanding. And so then what I did is I exposed all of the yellow that I wanted to give it that kind of pattern that travels along these rivet lines and panel lines, and then came back and did the actual hairspray chipping with a wet brush to expose the aluminum underneath. And that not only gives me the look that I want with the abraded color coat on top of the primer, but it makes the actual chipping quite a bit easier. So I feel like that's a really controlled and effective process. I did a lot of sanding in other areas as well, because I wanted to show, for example, how the these green scallops might get abraded away on top of the olive drab where they get walked on all the time. And then as well, like right here on the insignia, I did some sanding before I did the oil work, just again to kind of expose that and show some softer edges. Hopefully that tells the story effectively. I also did a little bit of it on this insignia over here, but mostly that's just oil work right there to show that the ground crew guys were getting into that hatch, because that's where there's a hydraulic reservoir and oxygen tanks and radio stuff and all kinds of things in there. And I wanted to show that with the filth around the hatch, but not on the hatch itself. So anyway, hopefully that tells the story pretty well. One little sort of thing, speaking of hatches, that I had to do. This was kind of, I guess, a small bit of drama. This little hatch right here covers the filler cap for the engine oil tank. And you get two parts in the kit for that. One has that little hump that you see right there. The other one does not. And of course, I was going to use the one with the hump and managed to lose it. So I had to use the part without the hump and fabricate that little hump. And I did it by cutting the end of a sprue off where it's kind of round, right where it goes into the gate, and just shaping it and gluing it on there and kind of blending it in. It worked out pretty good, but yeah, that was another day of work. So anyway, let me address one other thing that I kind of forgot, because again, if you are if you're pretty literate in p-40s, you may be going, okay, wait a minute, Pattison. All right, we might give you that the the skull thing was one particular gangster artist in the squadron, and we might let you slide on the ailerons being painted with the scallops, but you've got what is clearly a late model p-40 with the long tail, so most likely an M or an N, but you've got the early stamped aluminum seat as opposed to the later version of the seat that was made out of plywood and steel. And you don't have the little gizmos that stick out of the wings to let the pilot know that his landing gear is down. That was on every P-40N and later. And you've got the scalloped rear window. And the scalloped rear window only came on P-40N-5 and earlier. So, WTF, Pattison, what actually is this P-40? So, here's my story. All right, it is true that the scalloped window only showed up until P-40N-5. And you can see that when you look back here at the color panels. All right, like this one, you can see P-40N1 got the scalloped rear window. This one, they're not really telling you which one it is, but it's got to be. It can only somewhere during the -5 block is when the scalloped rear window went away, and they switched to that thing and a different armored headrest and definitely a different seat. Okay, but it is also true that if it's an N, it's supposed to have that indicator for the landing gear. Well, guess what did not have the indicator? The M model, at least about halfway through the production of the M model. Now, there were not a shit ton of M models that went to the CBI theater. There weren't a shit ton of M models built in the first place, but that doesn't mean there were none, right? The other thing is that with it having the scalloped rear window, which definitely appeared on the M model, you could have bolted in this earlier version of the seat. So that's kind of what I'm doing there, is saying, all right, parts, spare parts were in short supply. We needed a seat. That's what we put in there. I like those kind of mismatches as long as it can sort of be, justified or validated with actual history. And I feel like in this case that it can, even though you really kind of have to get down into the, the nitty gritty of the production variation, to do that. But the truth is that Curtiss was sort of infamous for not being really disciplined about their variants. I mean, they certainly were not North American. So, it's possible. I mean, they were maybe not as bad as early Spitfires, for example, but Curtiss was certainly, known for being a bit all over the map. And here's another thing that somebody asked me about is a lot of P-40s, early P-40s definitely, had canvas covers inside the wheel wells to prevent, all kinds of debris from getting up in here exactly the way that I've depicted it as, flying off of the wheels. Yeah, well, you got to talk to Hasegawa about that because they didn't give you that option for putting those in there. And I wasn't even caring enough about the wheel wells to try and, really do a better job of adding cables and hoses and whatnot. So, that's the deal. Anyway, this is with the bottom of the thing. The areas that I was talking about with fit regarding the landing gear, specifically getting them into their sockets far enough. I had to futz with them, had to make some clearance cuts and do some filing to get them to go all the way down in there. That was super annoying. And then when they were correctly in place, these little struts did not fit correctly. Basically, one of them would go all the way into its little socket right there, and the other one was lifted up about 0.5 millimeter because they just didn't take into account that there's an angle right here on this wing surface. So I had to deal with that by chopping one of them off and just forcing it into place, and it doesn't look quite right. But again, you do what you got to do. I did a couple of other detail things. The brake lines, I think, are super important on a P-40 because they're so obvious. Again, I use lead wire like I normally do for those. The little clamps are made with 0.4 millimeter ISO tape for the clamp band, and then a little piece of aluminum tubing for the Albion aluminum tubing for the actual like part that the hose goes through. But you can see the really nice detail on the insides of the wheels that makes a lot of that relatively easy to do. It's and it looks good. I used bare metal foil to wrap around the oleo to give you the shiny chrome part of that. So all just pretty straightforward stuff. I mentioned in the weathering part that I used some acrylic ink. That's something that I've been doing more and more of. I did the most of this dirt using acrylic ink, and these are Liquitex inks. I really like them a lot because they're highly pigmented. They let you do really subtle things. They thin really well with Tamiya X20A, and you can spray them out of the airbrush. You can put them on with a sponge. You can do a lot of the things that you can do with oils, and I really like the effects and how subtle they can be. And using this 409 trick, and guys have been finding some other things that you can use in place of 409 because it's not available all over the world. The key ingredient is like 0.5% of ammonium chloride. But you can wash it right off. Like, this was actually the second go round on all of this dirt. I did this whole area once, decided I didn't like it, spent about 5 minutes washing it all off, and then completely redid it and was much happier with the result. But basically the same stuff that you would do with oils other than spraying it out of an airbrush. I typically am not going to do that with oils, but with inks, it works great. And with X20A as the reducer, and I'm talking like 10-to-1 typically to create a light stain like this, that lets it bond to MRP pretty well because it's a lacquer, and X20A will etch in there just a little bit. But you do have to protect it because mineral spirits will take it off. So there's a layer of GX113 on top of all the acrylic ink work. And then I did all of my oil work to create the streaks and some of the speckling and staining that you see. A lot of p-40 reference photos show you this really characteristic filth around these gun panels. And I really want to try to incorporate that. Somebody told me that it was pretty common for them to wash these gun bays out with diesel and then basically dump a can of oil down the barrel of each machine gun just to make sure that they weren't going to jam. And so that's where you get all of this, mung coming out of the ejector ports and out of the the edges of the panel and giving you these streaks. And I love it. I think it's cool. And I think that these are, pretty representative of some photos that I saw. I did kind of my usual trick of using, putting the oils down kind of where the streak is going to start and then forming it using a ruler. Actually, for my ruler, I just use the edge or the side of a Infinity sanding sponge. Just lay it on there like that, and then run my brush along it to develop the streak and make sure that they're nice and straight. Oh, look, the canopy's falling off. Yeah, I thought maybe I bumped that while I was doing something. It's only glued on there with masking fluid, and it was, so that exact thing wouldn't happen. But at any rate, not a big deal. The last thing I'm going to cover with the bottom of this is you might have noticed in the photos that there is a picture of this thing mounted to a sort of bizarre looking display stand. What the heck is that all about? Well, here's the story. So I believe that, a lot of the most interesting shit happens on the belly of an aircraft. But you never get to see it, right? You don't really want anybody picking it up to look at it. That's a stabbing offense. And I don't really like putting them on a mirror because that doesn't really do it, just doesn't really do it for me. And there was a moment where I thought I might take this to IPMS Nationals. And I was like, okay, well, if I were going to take this to a contest and I wanted people to be able to see the bottom of it without a mirror and without picking it up, how would I do that? And I went into, ridiculous enginerd mode. And I designed that stand, which I will explain here in a second. But the thing you have to know is that there is a 2.5mm socket, like from a little socket wrench set, buried inside the fuselage in here and very firmly super glued in there. I mean, it didn't go on, you know, you'd have to melt this whole thing down for that socket to come out of there. And the reason the socket is in there is because conveniently the 40 has that hole and the back of that little louver right there. And what happens is, at least if everything works the way that it's supposed to, is that with this display stand, ridiculous thing that it is, that it's got this, you guessed it, 2.5mm Allen key sticking out of this shaft right here to plug into that socket. And yeah, this is so dumb. This is like the dumbest display stand in the history of display stands. But I just got carried away. This was not only, you know, an engineer having a ridiculous idea, but, you know, Fusion 360 making it way too easy to insert parts from the McMaster car catalog directly into your assembly. Got some fly specks on my brilliant metal finish. Anyway, yeah, it got out of hand pretty quick. But what happened here is this whole thing is 3D printed. This big chunk is 3D printed, and we had to print it in 4 different parts because it was too big for the printer, and gluing it back together, yeah, that was a giant ass whipping. I put approximately a ½ pound of Bondo on this thing. Yeah, not fun, but you know, it's just basic modeling skills, right? The gears and the crank are 3D printed as well. The shaft, this little rotating knob gizmo, the screws, the collars for the shafts, those are all McMaster car parts. So, you know, pretty readily available hardware. The gears, there's an app that you can get that plugs into Fusion 360 that allows you to create gears by basically just specifying the diameter, the pitch, the thickness, and then it just spits out the entire gear, and you know, voila, my mesh is a little tighter than it should be, but that actually turns out to be a good thing because I don't really want it to spin spontaneously, but it's got about a 3-to-1 ratio. And the idea is that you should, in theory, be able to, and this is, man, I don't want to do this on screen because this has definitely got major disaster potential, but the idea is to be able to take the little bird and very carefully slide it onto and get it engaged with the socket. Not quite there yet. There it is, I think. There it is. Yep. Ha! Did it. Yeah, that was nerve-wracking. Anyway, it is now engaged with that socket. And so, one thing that I didn't really account for, however, was the slop between the hex key and the socket. And that's why I got a little bit of this. And in my first test runs, I actually broke off that little gizmo right there on the bottom of the fuselage, and that's also why there's this little dog leg in the hex key, because I had to modify the hex key to make sure it cleared. I broke the tail wheel off once during all of that, but nonetheless, there it is. It's on there, and here we go. This is what happens. Oh, okay, so my airplane is sitting here like this. Looking pretty dope, right? Looking pretty cool. There it is. Oh, Hello, Mr. Judge. You want to see the bottom of my airplane? Okay, cool. Just grab this crank over here and just go like this. And there it is. Look at that. You can see the bottom of my airplane without having to touch it, without having to use a mirror. Yeah, I know, it's pretty ridiculous, but like I said, sometimes engineers just run amok. Okay, so there you go, and that's that. I really, I hope that my next project does not take as long. I don't necessarily mind a project that takes, I guess, let's see, this one, I started on the cockpit last October. There was probably 3 months in there where I didn't work on it, so let's just say that I've got like 9 months, 8 months or something like that in this project. And I don't necessarily mind that, especially when I'm enjoying it as much as I have this project. Because the truth is, I just fell in love with the subject and the project. And it was kind of like a 9-month love affair where everything is great, but when it has to come to an end, it comes to an end. There was really no major drama. It was good fun. But anyway, it's done, and I'm probably going to go into a period now where I get back to my sort of round robin thing, where I'm working on multiple stuff. This thing, honestly, I was just so into it that I didn't want to work on anything else, and that's a little unusual for me. But at any rate, I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's next, but whatever it is, I hope you guys will tune in because I always appreciate that. And as always, much love.